The afternoon in the park had started like any other ordinary day. Families sat on blankets, eating snacks and enjoying the warm sunshine. Children ran across the grass, chasing each other, while older people walked slowly along the path, talking about their day. A light wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of fresh grass and the distant sound of laughter. Nothing seemed unusual, and no one expected anything special to happen. It was just a normal day in a quiet park, where people came to relax and forget about their problems for a while. Near the center of the park stood an old upright piano. It had been placed there by a local community group that wanted to encourage people to make music. Most of the time, the piano sat unused. Sometimes children banged random keys, giggling at the noise. Sometimes a beginner tried to play a simple song. But no one ever stopped what they were doing to really listen. The piano looked worn out and tired, like it had survived many years without proper care. Its wood had scratches, and its keys were slightly yellow, giving it a look that was both old and mysterious. On this particular afternoon, a stranger walked toward the piano. He did not look very special. He was not dressed in expensive clothes, and he did not carry anything that showed he was a musician. He walked casually, with an easy, relaxed posture, as if he had all the time in the world. He seemed like someone who might just sit on a bench, watch the birds, or read a book. No one paid attention to him at first. He was just another face in the crowd. But the stranger stopped in front of the piano and looked at it with a quiet seriousness, as if he recognized something in it that others had missed. He ran his fingers gently along the top, brushing away a thin layer of dust. He stared at the keys for a moment, almost like he was remembering something far away, maybe from a different time in his life. The look in his eyes changed, filling with a kind of longing that is hard to describe, but easy to recognize in someone who once loved something deeply. A few people glanced in his direction, curious but not overly interested. They watched him the way strangers watch each other in public, briefly, without much thought. But then he did something that caught attention. He turned toward a group of people standing nearby and asked, in a gentle voice, "Can I play that old piano?" His question was simple but unusual. People didn't normally ask for permission to play it. Usually they just walked up, touched the keys, and made noise. His politeness made the moment feel different, as if he was asking for something more than just a chance to sit and play. He waited for an answer, patiently, hands in his pockets, eyes friendly but slightly nervous, like someone who did not want to disturb anyone. The people he spoke to looked at each other with small smiles, unsure if he was serious. Some of them thought it was funny. The stranger did not look like a professional musician. He looked like a regular man who might play a few clumsy notes and walk away embarrassed. Someone shrugged and said, "Sure, go ahead," with a joking tone. Another person laughed lightly, not expecting anything interesting. They assumed it would be silly or awkward, maybe even entertaining to watch. But the stranger did not laugh. He nodded with appreciation, as if the simple permission meant something important to him. When he sat down at the piano bench, he didn't slam the keys or make loud noise like others had done before. Instead, he sat properly with his back straight and placed his hands calmly on the keyboard. He took a slow, deep breath as though preparing for something meaningful. People around him began to pay more attention, not because they expected greatness, but because they sensed a shift in mood. The stranger's posture, his focus, and the quiet seriousness of his movements made him different from the many casual players before him. Children stopped running for a moment. A couple eating snacks paused to watch. Even the birds seemed quieter, as if the whole park was waiting to see what would happen next. What made the moment interesting was not just the piano or the stranger, but the contrast between them. The piano looked old and abandoned, but he treated it like something valuable. The crowd expected something small and forgettable, but he behaved like someone about to share a secret. There was a hidden story in his eyes, something about love, memory, or pain, but no one knew what it was yet. His question, "Can I play that old piano?" suddenly felt more important than anyone first realized. It was not only a request to play music. It sounded like a request to express something he had carried inside his heart for a long time. Maybe he had not played in years. Maybe this old piano reminded him of someone he had lost. Maybe music was once the most important part of his life, and fate had brought him to this moment to rediscover it. The crowd did not know any of this. To them, he was just a stranger asking a simple question. But in reality, that moment was the beginning of a story none of them would forget. The old piano, the ordinary park, the laughing people, all of it was about to change. And all because one quiet man asked a question everyone ignored at first, but would later repeat in their minds again and again. "Can I play that old piano?" The stranger's question still echoed in the minds of the people around him, even after permission was given. Some of them smiled, shaking their heads lightly, amused by the situation. They didn't think anything serious was going to happen. In fact, most of them imagined he would hit a few wrong notes, laugh awkwardly, and walk away. It was easy to assume that because the piano looked old, anyone who played it would sound just as rough. There was a small group of teenagers standing close by. They had been joking with each other before, but now they turned their attention toward the stranger, whispering and laughing quietly. One of them pulled out a phone, ready to record what might be a funny moment. They wanted content, something to post online, even if it was just a joke. They didn't expect anything worth remembering. A couple nearby sat on a bench eating sandwiches. The woman nudged the man and pointed toward the piano. They both smiled, thinking it would be entertaining to see someone try and possibly fail. The park, although peaceful, often lacked excitement. They were ready for a simple distraction, nothing more. Even a man walking his dog slowed down, curious about the situation. He leaned on a lamppost, waiting to see what would happen. His dog tugged at the leash, uninterested, but he stayed still, eyes on the stranger, expecting something amusing. Most people were responding in the same way: light amusement, mild curiosity, and low expectations. They weren't cruel exactly. They just didn't take the situation seriously. No one believed that the old piano and a random stranger could create anything meaningful. To them, it was a small, unimportant moment. But the stranger seemed unaware of their laughter, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His face remained calm, almost peaceful. He waited patiently as if he wasn't rushing to prove anything. When he sat down on the bench before the piano, the crowd's amusement grew a little stronger. Some of them raised their eyebrows, thinking, "This will be interesting." The bench creaked slightly under his weight, and the piano's old keys gleamed faintly in the sunlight. He sat with his back straight, feet placed firmly on the ground, and eyes fixed on the keyboard. He did not look around to see who was watching, nor did he make any attempt to speak. He simply existed in that moment, silent and focused. Someone in the crowd whispered, loud enough for others to hear, "I bet he can't even play." A few people laughed quietly. Another person replied, "Maybe he'll surprise you." But even that comment was spoken more as a joke than a genuine belief. There was something about the stranger's posture, however, that made a few people hesitate. He looked comfortable, almost too comfortable for someone who didn't know how to play. His hands rested still, but not awkwardly. Instead, they waited with a confident patience, like hands that remembered. And though no one understood what that meant yet, they sensed something slightly different. As he prepared to play, the wind blew gently, brushing leaves across the ground and making the trees rustle softly. The noise of children in the distance faded little by little as eyes turned toward the piano. People didn't stop what they were doing because they expected greatness, far from it. They simply didn't want to miss what could be an embarrassing moment. Sometimes, people enjoy watching others fail more than succeed because it makes them feel less imperfect. One teenager hit the record button on his phone and whispered, "This is going to be hilarious." His friend laughed and agreed. They were ready to capture an awkward performance, then share it online as something funny. They already imagined the captions they would write. But a few people in the crowd weren't laughing. A mother holding her baby stared curiously. An elderly man leaned forward slightly. A girl sitting on the grass stopped drawing in her notebook and looked up. They didn't know why they were interested, they just felt something different. Still, the overall mood remained playful. A young woman smirked and said, "He must think he's a star." Another responded, "Maybe he'll play the same 3 notes we all know." Laughter followed the comment, light but dismissive. The stranger glanced up once, not at the crowd, but at the open sky above him. It was a quick, thoughtful look, as if he was remembering something or searching for courage. Then he lowered his gaze back to the keys, exhaling softly. One more chuckle came from the crowd, but it faded quickly. Something about the moment shifted subtly, though no one could point to what changed. It was not dramatic, not loud. It was more like the silence that falls before a story begins, quiet, fragile, and full of possibility. Finally, after what felt like a long pause, he lifted his hands and placed them on the keys with gentle precision. The crowd leaned forward automatically, not because they cared deeply, but because they were curious to witness the first mistake. No one expected beauty. No one imagined they were seconds away from seeing something unforgettable. They were prepared to mock, laugh, record, and move on with their day. They believed completely in their assumptions, that ordinary people do ordinary things, and that nothing meaningful comes from a stranger playing an old piano in a park. But assumptions are fragile, and sometimes the smallest moment destroys them completely. The stranger took one calm breath, closed his eyes, and pressed the first key. And everything people thought they knew was about to fall apart. The first note that came from the piano did not sound broken or awkward like many expected. Instead, it was warm, clear, and strangely beautiful. It floated across the park, soft but powerful, catching the attention of anyone within hearing range. For a moment, people did not react. They were confused, as if their ears did not believe what they just heard. Some of them blinked, surprised that the old piano could produce such a pure sound. Then came the second note and the third, and soon a gentle but confident melody began to form. His fingers moved with grace, not rushed, not nervous, but certain. The sound was not loud, yet it carried emotion. It held a softness that made the air feel different, almost heavier with meaning. The crowd, who had been ready to laugh, fell quiet quicker than they expected. Their faces changed from amusement to curiosity and then to disbelief. One of the teenagers with the phone lowered his camera slightly, confused. He whispered to his friend, "Wait, he can actually play." His friend didn't reply. His eyes were wide, focused entirely on the moving hands in front of him. No one had imagined that a random stranger would sit down at an old piano and create music like this. It was too unexpected, too good to be real. The man playing the piano had changed too. His face looked different now, no longer just calm, but deeply connected to what he was doing. His expression held a mix of concentration and emotion, like every note mattered. His eyes were half closed, not because he wanted to look dramatic, but because he could feel the music more clearly that way. He wasn't performing for applause or attention. He was playing because something inside him needed to come out. The melody grew stronger, more complex. His left hand created deep, rich sounds, while his right hand danced lightly, weaving a story through the air. People could not explain why it felt emotional, but it did. It was the kind of music that made the listener feel something, even if they didn't understand what it meant. A little girl holding an ice cream cone stood frozen, the ice cream melting down her hand, unnoticed. A businessman who had been walking quickly through the park stopped completely, eyes fixed on the stranger. A woman who had been scrolling her phone put it down slowly, as if the music demanded full attention. The world around the piano seemed to shift. Noise faded. Even the birds seemed quieter, or maybe the music simply drowned everything else out. The stranger's hands moved faster now, full of confidence and skill. He wasn't just playing notes. He was expressing pain, joy, memory, something big, something honest. It felt intimate even though dozens of people were watching. Someone whispered, "Who is he?" No one answered, no one knew. A few people started recording again, but this time with a different expression, not to make fun, not for jokes, but because they sensed something rare was happening. They wanted proof. They wanted to remember. The teenager who had expected comedy now held his phone steady, eyes emotional, whispering, "This is crazy." The couple on the bench who had hoped for entertainment stared in silence, their sandwiches untouched. The woman swallowed hard, feeling something unexpected, a small ache in her chest. The man's eyes softened, his earlier amusement gone. They didn't speak because they didn't want to disturb the moment. The man with the dog stood still, shoulders relaxed now, a small smile creeping onto his face. The dog sat at his feet, calm, surprisingly quiet. Something invisible had changed in the park. People who had been strangers to each other just minutes ago suddenly shared a silent connection. The music shifted again, slowing down, turning delicate like a whisper. His fingers touched the keys as if they were fragile, as if one wrong move would destroy something precious. Some people felt tears forming without understanding why. Others felt goosebumps, their hearts beating faster. The stranger did not look up, did not search for approval. He simply continued, lost in a world built from sound and memory. Anyone watching him closely would notice something else, a tiny shake in his hands, not from fear but from emotion too powerful to hide. People began to wonder about him. Was he a trained musician? Was he famous once? Why was he here playing an old piano in a public park? But the most important question wasn't who he was. It was why the music felt so personal. It was as if each note was a memory, a story, a confession. Something about it sounded like heartbreak but also healing. Like someone who had been lost for a long time was finding their way back. A young mother holding her baby wiped her eyes with her sleeve, confused by her own reaction. The baby watched quietly, unusually still. An old man nearby nodded to himself, understanding something others could not see. He recognized the music not by ear but by heart. The melody rose again, powerful, sharp, almost demanding to be heard. It filled the park with something beyond sound, something alive. People inhaled deeply, many without realizing it, as if the music had taken their breath away and was now giving it back in pieces. No one laughed anymore. No one felt the need to. Whatever joke had been expected had vanished. What replaced it was respect, admiration, and a growing sense of wonder. The stranger was no longer just someone sitting at a piano. He was someone who carried history in his hands, someone who had lived, struggled, lost, loved. Every note felt like a truth spoken without words. And as the music continued, the crowd slowly realized something remarkable. They were witnessing a moment that would not come again, not like this, not ever. They had looked at him once and judged without thinking. Now they watched in silence, humbled, changed, and unsure how to describe the feeling that was growing inside them. The stranger, still lost in the music, had no idea that he was already making history. The music continued to flow from the old piano, growing richer and more intense with every passing moment. People in the crowd stood frozen, eyes wide, ears focused, hearts strangely full. It was surprising how quickly their reactions had changed. Minutes ago, they were ready to laugh. Now they couldn't look away. What made the moment even more powerful was the silence in the crowd. It wasn't forced. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a natural silence, the kind that happens when people are fully absorbed, when the world feels like it has stopped moving because something beautiful is happening. Even children, who rarely stayed quiet, watched with calm, curious eyes. The stranger playing the piano didn't speak a word, but his body said enough. His shoulders rose and fell gently with each phrase. His face showed tiny expressions, sometimes pain, sometimes joy, sometimes something too complicated to describe. His fingers moved expertly, but not in a show-off way. It was not about speed or tricks, it was about feeling. His playing didn't say, "Look at me," it said, "Listen to this." For many, this contrast made the moment even more striking. The man wasn't trying to impress anyone, but in doing so, he impressed everyone. It reminded people of something they hadn't felt in a long time, what it was like to witness someone truly passionate about something. A little boy sitting on the grass slowly put down his soccer ball and leaned forward, eyes wide, as if he had discovered magic. His mother whispered gently, "Do you like it?" The boy nodded without speaking. He didn't know how to explain it, but he knew the music felt different, important. Nearby, a teenage girl, normally glued to her headphones, pulled them off and listened with full attention. She had never heard piano music live before, not like this. Her eyes softened, her shoulders relaxed. She didn't know anything about classical music or technique, but the emotion spoke to her anyway. It wasn't just notes. It was a feeling that reached her before she could resist. The businessman who had stopped earlier checked his watch, then slowly put it away. He was late for a meeting, but he didn't leave. Something inside him whispered that work could wait, because moments like this did not come often. He stood still, staring, letting the music wash over the stress and noise in his mind. The stranger's hands moved faster again, playing a section filled with energy and power. It was the kind of passage that usually makes audiences clap or gasp, but no one made a sound. They were too stunned. His fingers flew, but his face remained calm, almost peaceful, as if the difficult part was easy for him, as if he had played it 1,000 times before. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He must be a professional." Another replied softly, "Maybe famous." A third person added, "Why would someone like that be here?" The questions multiplied silently, growing heavier with every brilliant note that echoed through the park. No one had any answer. But deep down, everyone wondered what kind of life he had lived to play like this. A middle-aged woman standing alone felt her eyes fill with tears. She didn't cry easily, not in public, not in front of strangers. But this music reminded her of her brother, who had been a pianist before he died. The memory came back suddenly, painfully, almost violently, as if the music had pulled it from the deepest part of her heart without asking permission. She covered her mouth, trying to hide her emotion, but a quiet sob escaped her. The person beside her glanced over but said nothing. They understood. The piano's old wood vibrated gently, almost like it was alive again. For years it had been ignored, treated like an object, something to look at, not something to feel. But now it sounded like it had regained its purpose, its soul. The crowd could hear the age in the instrument, but they also heard the strength. The old piano and the stranger seemed to share something. Both were worn, both forgotten, both beautiful when finally given a chance. The music softened once more, drifting gently like a lullaby. People took slow breaths, as if waking from a dream. A warm breeze passed through the park, carrying petals from a nearby tree. They fell around the piano like light confetti, soft, fragile, glittering in the sun. People looked at each other sometimes, not speaking, not smiling, just sharing the silent understanding that they were living a moment they would remember. It wasn't the kind of memory that came from big events or famous places. It came from quiet beauty, unexpected and pure. One teenager, still recording, whispered, "I feel weird." His friend replied, "Me too, like I want to cry but I don't know why." They weren't embarrassed to admit it. The music made them honest. As the piece continued, the stranger began to look overwhelmed. His breathing changed. His hands trembled slightly. He played with a force that felt necessary, like something inside him was fighting to escape. The music grew painfully emotional, almost heartbreaking. Some people placed their hands over their chests, feeling something heavy there. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound take them somewhere they hadn't visited in a long time. Memories, regrets, lost dreams, forgotten hopes, emotions that usually stayed quiet began to rise, awakened by the music. The stranger couldn't speak these feelings, so he played them. The piano became his voice, his honest, wounded, beautiful voice. And the crowd listened, completely silent, completely changed. They had expected a joke, a failure, a moment to laugh at. Instead, they received truth. A truth that played through old keys and skilled hands, into their ears, through their hearts, and deep into the parts of themselves they rarely visited. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his past. But they knew, without a doubt, that this stranger had lived, really lived. And through this music they were living with him, if only for a moment. The music reached a point where it no longer felt like a performance but a confession. Each note seemed to carry a story, a memory, a secret only the stranger understood. People didn't know why the music felt so heavy, but they sensed it came from a place of truth. It was not perfect in a showy way. It was perfect in a human way, raw, flawed, honest. As the notes slowed, the stranger's shoulders curled slightly forward, as if the weight of his own history was pressing down on him. His eyes stayed closed, not to hide from the crowd, but because the music demanded all his attention. He was somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere painful. The park was merely the stage his memories happened to walk through. The crowd watched, breathless. Even those who knew nothing about music could feel something shifting in the melody. It moved away from loud, powerful chords and entered a softer, almost fragile place. The keys sounded lighter, like footsteps across thin ice. Some people leaned in closer, afraid they might miss something important. A middle-aged man in the crowd frowned, not from anger but from recognition. He had once played piano too, as a boy, before life forced him in other directions. Hearing the stranger made his chest ache, not with jealousy but with nostalgia. He whispered to no one in particular, "He plays like someone who lost something." The woman beside him nodded, though she wasn't sure what had been lost or by whom. The stranger's fingers moved slower now, almost trembling. The music didn't sound weak, it sounded vulnerable. It was as if he was telling the crowd a secret he never meant to share. And unlike spoken secrets, this one could not be misunderstood or argued with, it could only be felt. People began to imagine stories about him. Some thought he had been famous once, maybe even a prodigy. Others assumed he had faced tragedy, loss, heartbreak, failure. The truth didn't matter. The music made them believe something had happened, something that shaped him. And because of this belief, their hearts softened, not out of pity but respect. A young woman who had been recording earlier lowered her phone and kept it in her pocket. She didn't want a screen between her and the experience. She wanted to feel the moment fully, not analyze it later. Her eyes watered quietly, though she didn't understand why. She had never seen a stranger's pain expressed so beautifully. Nearby, a small child climbed into his father's lap, whispering, "Is he sad?" The father didn't know what to say. After a pause, he replied gently, "Maybe, but he's brave." The child didn't ask again. He hugged his father's chest and listened, learning something about feelings without words. The stranger's left hand played a low, steady rhythm while his right hand lightly traced the melody, almost like someone comforting another person with soft touches. It felt intimate but not romantic, more like a memory of someone holding on to something precious, something gone. And then, without warning, the melody changed. It grew hopeful, not suddenly but softly, like sunlight slowly breaking through clouds. People lifted their heads. Their hearts responded before their minds did. Something inside the music was healing now, or trying to. The stranger's hands moved with new energy. Not loud, not fast, just steady, warm, alive. It was as if he was telling the crowd, yes, there is pain, but there is also beauty, and both can exist together. The woman who had cried earlier took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The ache in her heart didn't disappear, but it softened. She whispered, "Thank you," though the pianist couldn't hear her. She wasn't thanking him for the music. She was thanking him for reminding her that grief could coexist with gratitude. The man with the dog stood up straighter, smiling quietly. He didn't know the stranger's story, but the music gave him courage. Courage to forgive himself for things long past. Courage to believe that broken parts didn't make a person worthless. They made them human. Another teenager who had first mocked the stranger now stood with crossed arms and red eyes. He looked embarrassed, not for crying, but for underestimating someone so deeply. He shook his head slowly and whispered, "I was wrong." It wasn't an apology to anyone in particular, just truth spoken into the air. The music continued, lifting the crowd in small, gentle waves of sound. There was no dramatic ending, no explosion of notes. The stranger didn't want to impress, he wanted to connect. And he did. People felt seen, heard, understood, even though no one said a word. Finally, the melody drifted toward silence. Not a sudden stop, but a slow, respectful farewell, like the final sentence of a long, emotional letter. The stranger held the last note a moment longer than expected, letting it fade naturally, softly, beautifully. Then he lifted his hands from the keys. Softly, beautifully. Then he lifted his hands from the keys. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. No one breathed. No one moved. The world seemed to hold itself still, stunned by what had just happened. The stranger exhaled, long and shaky, as if he had been holding his breath for years. He wiped one hand quietly across his eye, not dramatically, just honestly. If anyone noticed the tear, they pretended not to. The moment was too sacred to point out someone's vulnerability. The crowd didn't clap, not because they didn't want to, but because applause felt too small, too loud, too shallow for what they had just heard. Instead, they stood in silence, offering something deeper than applause, reverence. The stranger finally opened his eyes and looked up. He seemed surprised to see so many people watching. He looked humbled, almost embarrassed, as if he didn't believe he deserved their silence, let alone their admiration. But he did. In that moment, no one cared who he was. They only cared who he had become, someone who turned an ordinary afternoon into something unforgettable. And though no one knew it yet, the next few minutes would change everything, for him and for them. Because history doesn't always begin with a grand announcement. Sometimes it begins with silence, after a single, extraordinary song. For a long moment, neither the stranger nor the crowd knew what to do. The music had ended, but its effects still hung in the air, thick and heavy, like mist that refused to fade. People were caught between disbelief and wonder, unsure how to return to normal life after something that felt anything but normal. The first sound to break the silence was a quiet sniffle, not dramatic, just small, human. A woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked away, embarrassed that strangers might see her cry. But she wasn't alone. Many in the crowd felt the same confusing mix of feelings: sadness, hope, connection. The music had opened something inside them that life usually kept locked. Slowly, people looked at one another, almost as if they needed confirmation that what they had just experienced was real. No one spoke loudly. Every voice seemed afraid to disturb the fragile peace the stranger had created. A man whispered, "That was incredible," but his voice cracked and he cleared his throat awkwardly. The stranger sat still on the bench, hands resting quietly in his lap. He looked exhausted, not physically but emotionally drained, like someone who had just told a truth they didn't mean to reveal. He avoided eye contact, not out of arrogance, but because he didn't know how to face the crowd after exposing so much of himself. Part of him seemed surprised that so many people had gathered. When he first approached the piano, he had expected to play alone, unnoticed. He had not planned to perform. He had not imagined that his private expression would become a public experience. He looked down, unsure whether he should stand up and leave or remain seated and acknowledge the crowd. The uncertainty on his face made him appear vulnerable, almost childlike, despite the wisdom in his music. A little girl walked bravely toward him, holding a small daisy in her hand. She placed it gently on the corner of the piano. The stranger's eyes softened. He gave her a small, grateful smile, one that held more emotion than words could ever carry. The crowd watched this simple gesture and felt something warm bloom inside them. Finally, applause began, not loud, chaotic applause, but slow, respectful clapping that grew naturally, like rain starting gently before turning steady. It wasn't a celebration, it was gratitude. It wasn't about entertainment, it was about connection. Many clapped with both hands and hearts, thankful for what they had received without asking. The stranger didn't stand to bow. He simply nodded once in a humble acknowledgement of their appreciation. He seemed uncomfortable with attention. It was clear he wasn't used to being celebrated, or perhaps he had been celebrated once long ago and no longer desired it. A man near the front stepped forward and asked, gently, "Who are you?" The stranger looked at him, puzzled, as if the question wasn't actually simple. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. After a moment, he shook his head slightly, not dismissively, but honestly, as if saying, "I don't know how to explain." Another person asked, "Where did you learn to play?" Someone else asked, "Did you write that music yourself?" Questions built up quickly, not out of pressure but curiosity. People wanted to understand the mystery they had witnessed. They wanted a story to go with the feeling they couldn't describe. The stranger lowered his eyes and took a slow breath. He was searching for words, not to impress but to be truthful. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, cracked slightly, as if unused to speaking about himself. "I used to play," he said, only 5 words, but they carried weight like the echo of a life once lived. A few people leaned in, waiting for more. He continued almost reluctantly, "A long time ago." His voice carried sadness, not nostalgia. The crowd did not push him with more questions. They sensed that whatever story he carried was not simple, not happy, not something that should be dragged into the open by strangers demanding answers. The old man who had watched him closely stepped forward. His voice was calm, kind, filled with quiet wisdom. "Then you should keep playing," he said. "The world needs this." The stranger looked up, startled. Not because of the words, but because of the sincerity behind them. He seemed unsure whether to believe them. Life had not taught him that the world wanted what he had to offer. Life had taught him the opposite. Before he could respond, a teenager spoke, one who had expected a joke earlier. His voice shook a little with shame and admiration. "I'm sorry we laughed," he said. "We didn't know." The stranger blinked slowly, surprised by the apology. He didn't look offended. If anything, he looked grateful. He smiled gently and said, "It's okay." And he meant it. He had not come to prove anything. He had come to remember something he had lost. People kept standing there quietly, as if they didn't know how to walk away from a moment that felt sacred. No one wanted to be the first to break it. No one wanted to admit that life outside this moment would feel less meaningful. Finally, a young woman asked the question everyone else secretly held in their hearts. "Will you play again?" The stranger looked at the piano, then at the crowd. His uncertainty returned, mixed with hope. He wasn't sure he had the strength. Music took something from him every time he played, something he didn't always have to give. But the way the crowd looked at him, with warmth, respect, and genuine human connection, made him believe it might be worth it. He took a breath, placed his hands back on the keys, and whispered, barely audible, almost to himself, "I'll try." A hush fell over the crowd again. They braced themselves, hearts open, souls ready. Because they knew, without a doubt, they were about to witness something rare. Once more, the stranger's fingers touched the keys again, but not with the same confidence as before. His hands hesitated, hovering, unsure if they could carry the weight of more music. The crowd waited patiently, sensing the fragility of the moment. No one spoke. No one rushed him. They understood that whatever came next would not be just a performance, it would be a gift. He pressed a single note, soft and hesitant. It echoed through the park like a question, fragile but brave. He waited a second, almost listening to the sound fade, as if seeking permission from the piano itself to continue. The crowd leaned in, hearts gentle, ready to receive anything he offered. Slowly, a new melody began to form, different from the first. The earlier music had felt like a story of pain and loss. This one felt like a fragile attempt at hope, uncertain but real. His fingers moved slower, careful, as if each note was a step across unfamiliar ground. The crowd did not expect another masterpiece. They did not demand perfection. They simply listened, grateful for whatever came. They understood that vulnerability was not weakness. It was courage. A little breeze passed through the trees, carrying leaves across the ground. A few landed softly near the piano, as if nature was listening too. The moment felt sacred but not grand. It was small, tender, human. The stranger's posture slowly changed. At first he looked tense, almost afraid, but as the melody continued, something inside him softened. His shoulders relaxed. His hands steadied. He began to breathe with the rhythm, letting the music carry him rather than drag him. He played a gentle progression filled with warmth. It was delicate, like someone whispering a promise. People closed their eyes, letting the sound sink into them. It wasn't overwhelming or dramatic. It was soft medicine for tired hearts. A mother rocked her baby gently to the rhythm, humming quietly even though she didn't know the tune. A teenage boy held his breath, afraid that any movement might break the fragile magic. The old man who had spoken earlier watched with wet eyes, smiling faintly, as if seeing something beautiful that reminded him of his younger self. The stranger seemed to be rediscovering himself with each note. He wasn't performing anymore, he was healing. The music was not just heard, it was felt by him and by everyone watching. Midway through the piece, his expression changed. His eyes tightened slightly and a quiet pain returned to his face. Something inside the music shifted, too, becoming bittersweet, filled with memory. He didn't play louder, but the emotion sharpened, cutting through the quiet. People sensed the change. They felt the sadness rise again, not as a heavy burden but as truth. Healing doesn't erase pain, it holds it gently. The stranger's music reflected that truth. It carried heartbreak and hope side by side. Without realizing it, tears rolled down his cheek. They weren't dramatic sobs, just silent tears falling naturally, unhidden. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, letting the music speak for them. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's crying." Another whispered back, "Let him." No one tried to comfort him, no one tried to interrupt. They respected the vulnerability, they protected it with silence. The music continued, trembling slightly with emotion. But it didn't collapse. It stayed steady, moving forward like someone walking even with shaking legs. It was not a show of strength, it was a display of resilience. A young woman who had been distant from her own emotions felt something inside her break open. She had kept her pain locked for years, fearing it would destroy her. But watching the stranger cry and still play showed her that pain did not mean weakness. It meant survival. She covered her mouth, unable to stop the tears that finally escaped. The stranger reached a section of the melody that felt like a soft goodbye, not a dramatic ending, just a quiet conclusion, like closing a door slowly so the sound doesn't wake anyone. His hands moved slower and slower, until finally they rested gently on the last chord, holding it long enough for everyone to feel it. When the sound faded, his hands fell to his lap, exhausted. He sat still for a moment, breathing unevenly, eyes wet, shoulders shaking slightly. The crowd didn't clap immediately. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent, protective, full of empathy. Finally, one person whispered, "Thank you." Another echoed, "Thank you." Soon, soft voices all around repeated it, not like a chant but like prayer. "Thank you. Thank you." The stranger looked up, surprised to hear gratitude instead of praise. He looked at the faces around him, soft, kind, humbled. He had not expected kindness from strangers. He had come to the park alone, carrying a burden he thought was invisible. But somehow, through music, people had seen him and accepted him. He whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "I didn't know I needed this." His honesty broke something open in the crowd. Tears appeared again, not from sadness but from recognition. Everyone in that park had something they carried: loss, regret, fear, loneliness, and in that moment they felt less alone. The old man stepped forward again, voice steady and gentle. "Music doesn't just heal the one who listens," he said. "It heals the one who plays." The stranger nodded slowly, eyes lowered, absorbing the truth of those words. A teenager, voice shaky, managed to speak. Do you play anywhere, like in concerts?" The stranger shook his head. "Not anymore." "Why?" someone asked. He smiled sadly. "Life happened." What? People did not push for more explanation. They understood. Life happens to everyone. Then unexpectedly someone in the crowd said, "You should play again." And another person added, "People need this." What? More voices followed. "Please don't stop. Keep sharing it. You changed something today." The stranger looked overwhelmed, not with pride but with gratitude. His eyes shone again, this time not from pain but from hope. He stood slowly, hands trembling slightly, and whispered, "Thank you, all of you." The crowd did not cheer, they didn't shout. They simply smiled, nodded, and held the moment close to their hearts. Because they knew what they had witnessed was not a performance, it was a rebirth. And somewhere deep inside, the stranger knew it too. The stranger stood beside the piano, unsure of what to do next. The music had ended, but the moment did not fade. People still surrounded him, not like a crowd anymore, but like a community, gentle, respectful, connected in a way none of them expected when the afternoon began. He looked around slowly, taking in each face. He saw kindness, admiration, empathy, not pity, not curiosity, something deeper. It made him swallow hard, as if his throat had suddenly become too tight for words. He hadn't felt seen in a long time, truly seen. And now, standing in front of strangers, he felt both exposed and comforted. He reached out and touched the piano softly, like touching an old friend. His fingers traced the worn wood, the chipped edges, the slightly crooked keys. Imperfect things, yet still capable of making beauty. He felt connected to it, two survivors, both damaged, both still functioning in their own way. A person in the crowd finally asked the question everyone had wondered all along. "What made you stop playing?" The stranger paused. His eyes flickered with memory, as if a door he had locked long ago suddenly creaked open. He could have lied. He could have avoided the question, but he had nothing left to hide, not anymore. "I lost someone," he said quietly, "someone who believed in my music. After they were gone, playing felt wrong. Like the world didn't want to hear it anymore." The words hung in the air, soft and heavy. No one knew who he lost, parent, partner, friend, but they didn't need details. They felt the truth in his voice. The crowd didn't pry. They simply listened, letting silence respond for them. The stranger looked at the piano again, eyes soft. "I haven't touched one in years," he admitted. "Not until today." A woman near the back spoke carefully. "What changed?" "What?" He exhaled, thoughtful. "I don't know, I saw it sitting here, old and forgotten, and I felt like maybe it understood me." Tiny smiles appeared across the crowd, because they all felt the same strange magic. The way broken things sometimes find each other without planning to. A child raised his hand like he was in school and asked innocently, "Are you going to play again tomorrow?" The stranger laughed, a soft, shaky laugh filled with surprise. It felt like the first real laugh he had made in a long time. "I don't know," he said, "but maybe I should." The old man stepped forward one last time. His voice was steady, full of quiet certainty. "You don't need a stage," he said. "You just need a place and people who listen." What? The stranger nodded slowly, as if those words reached a part of him buried beneath layers of time and grief. People began to disperse, gently, respectfully, not because they wanted to leave, but because they understood the moment couldn't last forever. Some shook his hand, others simply smiled. A few whispered thank you again, not out of politeness but from their hearts. One teenage girl slipped a folded note onto the piano before walking away. He didn't open it immediately. He didn't need to. He understood the gesture, a quiet message from someone who had been changed. As the crowd thinned, the park began to breathe normally again. The sounds of life returned, children laughing, birds singing, footsteps on the path. But something felt different, like the air itself had learned something new. The stranger remained by the piano, alone once more, but not lonely anymore. He sat back down, but he didn't play. He just sat, letting the keys rest beneath his fingers, feeling their silent presence. He didn't need music in that moment. He needed stillness. His eyes wandered upward, watching clouds drift slowly across the sky. He thought of the person he had lost. He thought of the years he wasted avoiding something he loved. He thought of the strangers who listened today with open hearts, who cried without shame, who stayed without complaint. He whispered quietly, almost like a prayer, "I wish you could have seen this." The wind brushed his face softly like a response. He stood up, took one last look at the piano, and whispered, "Thank you." Not because it sounded dramatic, but because it was true. He began to walk away, steps slow, thoughtful. But before he left the park, he turned back and looked at the piano again, smiling faintly. A small decision formed in him, uncertain, fragile, but real. He would come back, not for applause, not for attention, but because music wasn't dead in him. It had only been sleeping. As he walked down the path, a sense of peace followed him. His grief hadn't disappeared. His past hadn't changed, but something inside him had shifted. A weight had lifted, not completely, but enough to let him breathe more deeply. He realized something important, that healing isn't sudden, it isn't loud, it isn't dramatic. Healing happens in small moments with gentle truths witnessed by strangers held by sound. He had played once and made history, not because the world filmed it or because millions would see it, but because a group of ordinary people were transformed by it. Because hearts opened. Because tears fell without shame. Because someone broken found courage to begin again. And as the stranger disappeared into the distance, the old piano sat quietly, waiting, no longer just a forgotten object, but a reminder of what happened when one human heart dared to speak. The story did not end with applause, it ended with hope, and that perhaps was history enough.